There is a particular kind of man that history struggles to let go of. Not a king, not a general, not a saint, but a man who, in a single extraordinary moment, reached out and took something so vast, so audacious, so completely beyond the imagination of ordinary life, that the world spent the next 300 years trying to figure out what to make of him. Henry Every was a pirate, but to call him simply, that is a little like calling the ocean simply wet. In the summer of 1695, in the warm and ancient waters of the Arabian Sea, Henry Every pulled off what many historians now regard as the single most profitable act of piracy in all of recorded human history. In the span of just a few hours, he and his crew seized a fortune so staggering, so overwhelming in its scope, that it triggered an international crisis, brought the might of the British Empire down upon his head, and made him the most wanted man on earth. And then, with all the world watching, with warships and bounty hunters and governments in pursuit, Henry Every simply vanished. No one ever caught him. That alone would be enough to earn him a place in the annals of the remarkable. But the story of Henry Every does not begin on that moonlit sea. It begins, as so many great stories do, with a quiet and unremarkable beginning, with a young man from a small port town in the west of England, looking out at the water and wondering what lay beyond it. He was born around 1659, most likely in the village of Newton Ferrers in Devon, a coastal corner of England where the smell of salt and timber was woven into the air from birth, where ships came and went with the tides, and where a boy with restless eyes had no shortage of dreams. The Devon coast in the 17th century was a world alive with maritime ambition. England was expanding. Trade routes were opening. The sea was not just a body of water, it was a road, and at the end of that road lay wealth beyond imagining. Every went to sea young, as so many Devon boys did. He served in the Royal Navy during the later years of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, learning the rhythms of a ship, the language of wind and canvas, the particular discipline that life on the water demands of a man. He was capable, observant, the kind of sailor who notices things, how a captain makes decisions, where a cargo is stored, what a vessel can truly do when pressed. He rose through the ranks in the way that competent men do, quietly and without spectacle. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. But the Royal Navy was not the path to fortune. It was the path to service. And Henry Every, it would become clear, had different ideas about where his life was meant to go. In the early 1690s, he found himself employed in a more irregular capacity, first in the slave trade, operating out at the Bahamas, and later as first mate aboard a privateering vessel called the Charles II, contracted by the Spanish government to harass French shipping in the Caribbean. It was here, in the heat and frustration of that venture, that something shifted in him. The expedition was plagued by delays. The crew went unpaid for months. The captains were indecisive. The men grew angry. And at some point during those long, sweltering nights anchored off the coast of Spain, Henry Every made a decision that would change his life, and the lives of everyone around him. In April of 1694, he led a mutiny. Quiet, efficient, and bloodless, he waited until the captains were ashore, roused the crew with a calm and convincing speech about wages owed and promises broken, and by morning he was in command of the ship. He renamed her the Fancy. He set sail. And from that moment forward, Henry Every was a free man, which is to say, he was a pirate. What followed over the next year was a voyage that took him around the Cape of Good Hope, up along the eastern coast of Africa, and into the waters of the Indian Ocean. Waters that, in 1695, were the beating heart of the world's most lucrative trade routes. He raided, he recruited, He moved with a patience and a precision that set him apart from the wild, chaotic buccaneers of popular imagination. Henry Every was not reckless. He was calculating. He was building towards something. And in September of 1695, off the coast of India, he found it. What happened next is the story we will spend this documentary telling. Because what Henry Every did in those waters, and what happened to him afterward, is not merely a pirate's tale. It is a story about empire and greed, about justice and its limits, about one man's impossible luck, and about the strange unresolved ending that has haunted historians for centuries. He took the treasure. He disappeared. And the world has never entirely stopped looking for him. To understand what Henry Every was about to do, you first have to understand the world he was sailing through. Because the Indian Ocean in the late 17th century was not simply a body of water. It was an argument, a negotiation conducted in wind and cannon fire between empires ancient and new, over who had the right to call that water their own. For centuries, the trade routes threading through those warm blue depths had been the most valuable corridors on earth. From the ports of India's western Mughal coast, great merchant fleets carried silk and silver, spices and gemstones, cotton and indigo, out toward the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, feeding markets that stretched from Cairo to Constantinople to the counting houses of Amsterdam and London. This was not modest commerce. This was the circulatory system of a civilization. At the center of that civilization stood the Mughal Empire, and at the center of the Mughal Empire stood its emperor, Aurangzeb, a man of immense power, immense piety, and a temper that lesser men did not test twice. Aurangzeb ruled over a domain that stretched across nearly the entirety of the Indian subcontinent, commanding a population and a treasury that dwarfed anything the European powers could yet claim for themselves. His word, within those borders, was the nearest thing to absolute that the 17th century knew, and his ships, the great merchant vessels that carried Mughal wealth and Mughal pilgrims across the Arabian Sea each year, moved through those waters with the confidence of vessels that had never had reason to doubt their safety. Into this world, the Europeans had come, carefully at first, then with increasing boldness. The English East India Company had established its footholds on the Indian coast, Surat on the western shore being among the most important, a city of extraordinary commercial energy, where goods from across the known world changed hands every single day. The company men walked a delicate line. They were traders operating by permission in someone else's empire. They bowed and negotiated and paid their dues and presented gifts to Mughal officials, because they understood quite clearly that their presence there depended entirely on the goodwill of the emperor whose land they were doing business in. It was a fragile arrangement, and it was about to be shattered. Every year, when the season was right, the great Mughal pilgrim fleet would depart from Surat, bound for the port of Mocha at the mouth of the Red Sea. The Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca, was among the most important obligations of the Muslim faith. And, for the wealthy and powerful of the Mughal world, undertaking it in appropriate style was a matter of both religious duty and social prestige. These were not modest vessels. The ships that made this crossing carried pilgrims, yes, but they also carried something else: the accumulated wealth that funded the voyage, the gifts appropriate to a journey of such religious significance, the personal treasures of noblemen and merchants who were not in the habit of traveling light. The largest and most magnificent of these ships in 1695 was called the Ganj-i-Sawai. The name, in Persian, means something close to exceeding treasure. It was a vessel of remarkable size for its era, carrying somewhere between 80 and 400 cannons depending on which account you trust, flying the flag of Aurangzeb himself, and transporting not only pilgrims returning from Mecca, but an almost incomprehensible quantity of gold, silver, and jewels. Accompanying it was a somewhat smaller escort vessel, the Fateh Muhammad. Together, they represented not just commercial value, but something more sensitive still: the personal prestige of the Mughal emperor on the open sea. Henry Every knew they were coming. He had not stumbled into position by accident. In the months leading up to that September encounter, he had been methodical in a way that spoke to genuine strategic intelligence, sailing with the Fancy, now a fast and well-armed vessel manned by a crew that had grown to trust him. He had coordinated with a small consortium of other pirate ships operating in the region. Together, they agreed to lie in wait at the mouth of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow passage at the southern end of the Red Sea through which the Mughal fleet would have to pass. It was the obvious choke point. It was, in the language of a later age, a trap. The waiting, as any sailor will tell you, is its own kind of work. Days passed, then weeks. The other ships grew restless. Supplies dwindled. Some of Every's would-be Confederates simply lost patience and sailed away, dissolving the alliance before it had achieved anything at all. It is the nature of enterprises built on shared greed that they tend to fracture under pressure, because no one in such an arrangement truly trusts anyone else. But Every waited, and his patience was not merely stoic endurance. He was watching, thinking, calculating the angles. He was the kind of commander who understood that the moment of action, when it came, would demand clarity and speed, and that those qualities had to be purchased in advance with stillness and preparation. His crew, by all accounts, had developed a genuine faith in him, not the fearful obedience that a brutal captain commands, but the quieter confidence that men extend to a leader who seems to know what he is doing. Then, in late August of 1695, the Fateh Muhammad appeared. The smaller of the two Mughal vessels came through the strait first, and Every moved on it without hesitation. The engagement was brief. The Fateh Muhammad's resistance, such as it was, collapsed quickly under the weight of the Fancy's firepower, and when Every's men went over the rails and into the hold, they found something that must have made every nerve in every body aboard the Fancy sing with a particular, electric joy. Gold, silver, coins and ingots, and accumulated wealth of a kind that most of these men had never seen in a single place in their entire lives. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary prize, and it was only the beginning. Because somewhere behind the Fateh Muhammad, moving slowly and heavily through those ancient waters, came the Ganj-i-Sawai, the exceeding treasure. Aurangzeb's own ship, flying the emperor's flag, carrying everything that flag implied. Every turned the Fancy toward it. What happened next lasted roughly 2 hours. The Ganj-i-Sawai was not defenseless. Her size and armament were considerable, and her crew outnumbered Every's substantially. In the opening exchange of cannon fire, she gave a creditable account of herself. One of her own guns, according to period accounts, burst during the fight. A catastrophic and demoralizing accident that killed or wounded a number of her own men and sent a tremor of shock through her defenders at precisely the moment when they needed to hold steady. Every pressed the advantage with everything he had. The Fancy drew alongside. Grappling hooks caught. Men swarmed across. What followed in the close and terrible quarters of that boarding action was brutal and without mercy. The violence that attended piracy in those waters was never theatrical, never clean, and the accounts that survive, fragmentary and biased as they are, make clear that the suffering was real and the terror absolute. The Ganj-i-Sawai's resistance, formidable at the outset, gave way under the ferocity and focus of Every's assault. Within 2 hours, it was over. Every stood on the deck of the most valuable prize ever taken by a pirate in the history of the sea. The wealth aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai has been estimated and re-estimated by historians for 3 centuries, and the numbers, even conservatively rendered, stagger the imagination. Contemporary accounts speak of somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 pounds sterling in gold and silver alone, at a time when an English labourer might earn 10 or 12 pounds in an entire year. There were jewels. There were gems taken from the personal possessions of noblemen and merchants, and returned pilgrims carrying gifts of sacred significance. There was, according to some accounts that historians debate with the careful skepticism their profession demands, a great ruby belt or girdle that may have been intended as a gift for the emperor himself. The total value, in the currency of the present day, has been placed as high as $200 million. Every had it all. He had his crew strip the prize methodically, efficiently, over the course of several days at sea. He was, in this as in everything, controlled. There was no wild frenzy. There was a process. And when the process was complete, every gathered what he had taken, set his course away from those waters, and began to think about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was the rest of the world arriving to express its fury. Because Henry, Every had not simply robbed a ship. He had humiliated an emperor. He had endangered the most important commercial relationship on the Indian subcontinent. He had handed the Mughal court of Aurangzeb, a man not known for his capacity to absorb insult quietly, the most visible and personal affront that could be imagined on the open sea, and the tremors of that single act, committed on a September morning in 1695, were about to travel in every direction at once. The English East India Company would feel them first. The news traveled the way. News always traveled in the 17th century, slowly at first, then all at once. It moved by ship and by messenger, by whispered rumor in the coffee houses of Surat, and by frantic dispatch rider across the dusty roads of the Mughal interior, gathering weight and detail and fury with every mile it covered. By the time the full account of what had happened on the Arabian Sea reached the ears of Emperor Aurangzeb, it had become something considerably larger than the story of a stolen ship. It had become an outrage, a violation, a wound to imperial dignity that demanded, with absolute urgency, a response. Aurangzeb's reaction was not subtle. The Mughal emperor had for years maintained a posture of tolerant pragmatism toward the English traders clustered in his port cities. He did not especially admire them. He did not particularly trust them, but they were useful. Their trade generated revenue. Their presence was manageable. And so long as they observed the appropriate courtesies and paid the appropriate fees and did not make themselves conspicuous in the wrong ways, he was content to let them operate within his domain. That calculation had always been conditional, and Henry Every had just demolished the condition. Aurangzeb ordered the immediate arrest of every English factor, every trader, every agent, every representative of the East India Company operating in Mughal territory, in Surat, in Broach, in Ahmedabad. Company men who had spent their careers building commercial relationships through patience and careful diplomacy found themselves dragged from their offices and thrown into prison. The company's trading posts were seized. Its goods were confiscated. Armed Mughal soldiers appeared at the gates of English warehouses and did not leave. For the East India Company, this was not merely inconvenient, it was existential. The company's entire reason for being, the commercial logic that justified its existence to its shareholders in London, the profits that flowed back to England, the whole elaborate apparatus of trade and influence that it had spent decades constructing, depended entirely on its ability to operate in Mughal India. Without access to those ports, without the goodwill of the emperor, the company was a fleet of expensive ships with nowhere to go and nothing to carry. Every account frozen, every relationship severed, every carefully cultivated connection potentially destroyed. All of it because one man with a fast ship and a calculating mind had decided to make himself the richest pirate who had ever lived. The letters that the company's directors sent back to London in those weeks make for remarkable reading. Beneath the formal language of 17th century commercial correspondence, you can hear something very close to panic. They were desperate to communicate to the Mughal court that they had nothing to do with Henry Every, that he was a rogue, a criminal, a man who operated entirely outside the law and entirely against the interests of the company and the crown alike, that they were as much his victims as anyone. Aurangzeb was not immediately persuaded. Why, the Mughal court wished to know, could the English not control their own people on the sea? If the English king, William III at this point, a man navigating the considerable complexities of his own political situation, could not prevent Englishmen from attacking Mughal ships, then what exactly was the value of the English presence in Mughal ports? What guarantee could they offer? What assurance was worth anything at all? These were not unreasonable questions. They were, in fact, devastating ones, because the honest answer, which no company man could afford to give, was that controlling pirates on the open ocean was genuinely beyond the capacity of any 17th century government. The sea was vast. Communication was slow. Naval resources were stretched. And men like Henry Every operated precisely in the spaces where authority frayed and accountability dissolved. But that honest answer would not save the company's imprisoned agents or restore its seized properties. So the company did the next best thing. It turned to the English government and made a demand that would have significant consequences for the future of maritime law. It demanded that Henry Every be caught, tried, and made an example of so spectacular that no pirate would ever again threaten the company's operations with such impunity. The English government, for its part, needed very little persuading. William III's administration issued what was, at the time, an almost unprecedented response to a single criminal act, a royal proclamation, a royal bounty, £500 for Henry Every, dead or alive, an enormous sum, enough to transform the life of anyone fortunate enough to collect it. Governors across England's colonial territories were commanded to make the capture of Every their priority. Naval vessels were diverted, notices were printed, and distributed to every port where an English ship might dock. Henry Every became, in the autumn of 695, the most wanted man in the English-speaking world. And yet, he was not caught, not that autumn, not that winter, not the following year. And the reasons for this reveal something important, not just about Every himself, but about the nature of the world he moved through. A world that was, despite its proclamations and its warships and its very considerable official fury, considerably less organized than it wished to appear. The Atlantic in the 1690s was threaded with ports and islands and hidden anchorages that existed in the comfortable shadows between jurisdictions. Nassau in the Bahamas. The remote inlets of Madagascar, which had become something close to an informal republic of pirates, a place where men who had placed themselves outside the law of every nation could nonetheless find a kind of society, a kind of commerce, a kind of life. Information moved slowly enough, and loyalties were distributed diffusely enough, that a man who knew how to blend into the waterfront life of a colonial port could make himself extraordinarily difficult to find. Every knew exactly how to do this. After the seizure of the Ganj-i-Sawai, he did not make the mistake that ambition sometimes makes. He did not linger. He did not celebrate too loudly or too publicly. He divided the plunder among his crew with a fairness that kept them loyal and quieted the kind of resentment that makes men talk too freely in taverns. And then he moved, first to the island of Réunion, then to the Bahamas, where he briefly put in at Nassau. Then little more than a ramshackle outpost, and where, according to some accounts, the corrupt governor accepted a bribe and allowed him and some of his crew to slip away quietly into the colonial population. His crew, inevitably, did not all manage the same disappearing act. Men who have suddenly come into extraordinary wealth are not, as a general rule, well suited to inconspicuousness. Some of Every's crew made their way to the American colonies, where their spending attracted attention and their stories attracted the wrong kind of listeners. Over the course of 1696, arrests began in Boston, in Philadelphia, in the Caribbean. One by one, men who had stood on the deck of the Fancy were found, detained, and transported back to England to face justice. The trials that followed in 1696 were among the most closely watched legal proceedings in England that decade. The Crown wanted convictions, the Company wanted a demonstration, and the men in the dock, ordinary sailors, many of them, who had signed on to the Fancy in circumstances of financial desperation, and found themselves swept up in something much larger than they had anticipated, faced a prosecution that was as much political theatre as legal proceeding. 6 of Every's crew were hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping, on the north bank of the Thames, in November of 1696. Their bodies were displayed in chains afterward, in the grim and deliberate tradition of the era, as a warning to any man who might be entertaining similar ideas about the profitability of piracy in the Indian Ocean. Henry Every was not among them. He was never among them. And this fact, this single, persistent, infuriating absence at the center of the entire story, is what transforms Every from a mere criminal into something that the imagination finds genuinely difficult to release. Every other element of this story has a resolution. The Company recovered, eventually. The prisoners were tried. The diplomatic crisis with the Mughal court was managed, painfully and expensively, over the years that followed. The sea lanes were, in time, better patrolled. The age of the great pirates would continue for another generation before the noose and the naval frigate slowly closed it down. But Every himself remained an open question. The world had seen what he had done. The world had spent enormous resources trying to answer him, and the world had come up empty. There was only one explanation that seemed to satisfy the requirements of the story, and it was an explanation that no one, in 1696 or in the years that followed, could either confirm or deny. Henry Every had gotten away with it, completely, permanently, in a way that no man of his kind, before or since, has ever quite managed to replicate. He was out there, somewhere, living on his fortune, living quietly, unreachable, and the world could not decide whether to be furious about that or secretly, grudgingly, a little bit amazed. There is a particular kind of disappearance that the human mind finds almost physically uncomfortable. Not death, which the mind can process, can mourn, can file away into the past tense and move beyond. Not imprisonment, which at least offers a location, a face behind bars, a story with a discernible ending, but a clean vanishing, a man who was here and then was not, and left behind no body, no grave, no confession, no final accounting. That kind of disappearance has a way of refusing to stay still in the imagination. Henry Every's disappearance was precisely that kind. In the years immediately following the attacks on the Mughal fleet, as the trials wound through the English courts and the diplomatic damage was being slowly, expensively repaired, the question of where Every had gone became something close to an obsession for the authorities tasked with answering it. Governors wrote to one another across the Atlantic. Ship captains were questioned in ports from Barbados to Boston. Informants were cultivated and paid and, as informants so frequently do, told their handlers whatever they judged most likely to result in another payment. The tips came in steadily. Every had been seen in the Bahamas. Every had been seen in Ireland. Every had been seen on the coast of West Africa, living among local traders with a new name and a new beard and a quiet, settled life that bore no visible relationship to the extraordinary events of 1695. None of the sightings led anywhere. Some of them were almost certainly fabrications. Others may have been genuine encounters with men who resembled him, or men who claimed to be him, because by 1696, being Henry Every, even falsely, carried a certain raffish prestige in the waterfront world that could be converted, in the right company, into free drinks and rapt attention. The bounty remained on his head, the proclamation remained in force, and Every remained, as far as anyone could demonstrate, entirely free. What is particularly striking, when you sit with this story long enough, is the quality of the silence that surrounds him after 1695. Most men of his era who achieved comparable notoriety left some trail, a letter, a deposition, a sighting that could be corroborated, a death that could be verified. The historical record of the 17th century is incomplete and imperfect in countless ways, but it is rarely this symmetrically blank on a subject of such intense official interest. The absence of Henry Every from the documentary record after his disappearance is not the ordinary silence of an unimportant man. It is the pointed, deliberate silence of someone who understood exactly how much attention he had attracted and had made a conscious, disciplined decision to give that attention nothing whatsoever to find. That discipline is, in its own way, as impressive as the heist itself. But the world does not handle impressive silence well, and so, into the space that Every's disappearance created, other voices moved. Storytellers, pamphleteers, the popular press, such as it was in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, found in Henry Every a figure almost perfectly suited to the particular hungers of its readership. Here was a man of humble origins who had, through boldness and intelligence, seized a fortune that placed him beyond the reach of kings. Here was a man who had humiliated the greatest trading company in the world, embarrassed the English crown, outrun the Royal Navy, and then, most satisfyingly of all, simply gone home, wherever home now was, and apparently gotten away with it. For an English public that was, in many respects, deeply ambivalent about the East India Company and its methods, about the distance between the wealth of the powerful and the poverty of the ordinary, there was something in Every's story that scratched a particular itch. He began, almost immediately, to become a myth. The first and most influential transformation came in 1709, when a writer named Charles Johnson, a name that some scholars have connected, in various ways, with Daniel Defoe, though the attribution remains debated, published an account that drew heavily on Every's story for its central figure. Then, a few years later, in 1720, Johnson published what would become the most famous document in the entire history of piracy, a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates. Henry Every appears in its pages not merely as a criminal but as a kind of dark hero, capable, audacious, and possessed of a freedom that the reader is clearly meant to find, at some complicated level, appealing. But the literary transformation had begun even earlier than that. In 1709, a popular play called The Successful Pirate appeared on the London stage. Its central character was drawn unmistakably from Every's life. And here the mythologizing took its most elaborate turn yet, because in this version of the story, Every had not simply escaped with his plunder. He had sailed to Madagascar, established himself as a king among the local population, married a Mughal princess taken from the very ship he had plundered, and built himself a miniature empire on that remote island where no European authority could touch him. It was a magnificent story. It was almost entirely fiction, but it lodged itself in the popular imagination with a tenacity that the duller facts of actual history could not dislodge. And for the better part of a generation, the image of Every as the pirate king of Madagascar circulated through English popular culture with remarkable persistence. Madagascar itself was not an invention. The island had, genuinely, become a kind of refuge for pirates in this period, a remote and resource-rich place where men outside the law could find anchorage and provisioning and a degree of safety from the naval patrols that were slowly tightening around the Atlantic trade routes. A small but real community of pirates and their families and associates had established themselves along its northeastern coast in a settlement sometimes called Libertalia in the romantic literature of the era. Though whether that settlement was ever as organized or as ideologically coherent as some accounts suggest, is a question that serious historians continue to debate with considerable vigor. What is clear is that Every spent time near Madagascar. What is equally clear is that the Pirate Kingdom version of his later life is a story that the 18th century told itself because it wanted that story to be true, not because there was reliable evidence that it was. The reliable evidence points somewhere considerably more modest and, in its own way, considerably more interesting. The most credible accounts of Every's final years, and they are fragmentary, and they are uncertain, and any historian worth their salt will tell you to hold them loosely, suggest that he returned to England, not to London where the risk of recognition would have been acute, but to the West Country, to Devon possibly, to the landscape of his childhood, the salt air and the green hills and the small harbour towns where a man of middle age with a quiet manner and enough money to live without drawing attention might simply settle and be no one in particular. Some accounts place him in Bidford, a small port town on the North Devon coast. Others suggest Bristol. The details vary depending on which source you consult and how much credence you extend to it. What the various accounts tend to agree on, in their broad outlines, is this: the money did not last, or rather, and this is the version that history has found most credible and most poignant, Every was cheated of it. The fortune he had taken from the Ganj-i-Sawai was, obviously, not the kind of wealth he could deposit in a bank or invest openly in legitimate commerce. It existed in the form of gold and jewels and coin, and converting that into a sustainable income without attracting catastrophic attention required the assistance of middlemen, merchants, fencers, men who understood how to move large quantities of unusual wealth through channels that did not ask too many questions, and who charged accordingly for that understanding. These men, if the accounts are to be believed, took rather more than their agreed share. There is something almost unbearably human about this part of the story. A man who had outthought the Mughal fleet, outmaneuvered the East India Company, outrun the Royal Navy, and outwitted the most determined manhunt in the English-speaking world, undone not by any of those formidable opponents, but by the ordinary grinding dishonesty of men he had trusted with his money. The audacious and the clever are not immune to the mundane. No one is. The last credible trace of Henry Every in the historical record places him sometime in the early years of the 18th century, somewhere in the west of England, reportedly in such reduced circumstances that he could not afford to pursue legal action against the merchants who had defrauded him, because pursuing legal action would have required giving his name, and giving his name would have required a courage of a different and rather more fatal kind than any he had exercised at sea. And then the record goes quiet again. No death notice, no burial record, no final accounting. He was there, and then he was not. The ghost dissolved back into the silence from which he had come, and the legend, the pirate king, the man who got away, the figure who had stood at the absolute apex of what piracy could achieve, and then stepped quietly off the stage, continued without him, growing larger and more elaborate with every passing decade, filling the space his absence left with the particular richness that only an unresolved story can generate, because we never found him. And part of us, even now, is still looking. There is a tendency, when telling the story of Henry Every, to follow the man himself, to chase the ghost, to speculate about the final years, to linger in the romantic uncertainty of his disappearance. And that tendency is entirely understandable. Every is a compelling figure, and the unanswered question of what became of him has a gravitational pull that is genuinely difficult to resist. But to follow only the man is to miss something important, because the consequences of what Henry Every did in those waters in September of 695 did not evaporate with his disappearance. They rippled outward. They reshaped institutions and rewrote laws and redirected the course of empire in ways that persisted long after the man himself had faded into rumor and conjecture. The stone he threw into that Arabian Sea sent waves to shores he never visited and generations he never lived to see. The most immediate and visceral of those consequences was felt, as we have seen, by the East India Company. But the nature of that consequence is worth examining with some care, because it is more complicated than it first appears. The company's initial response to the crisis, the frantic diplomatic messaging, the imprisoned agents, the letters of horrified innocents dispatched to the Mughal court, was essentially reactive. It was damage control. But within that damage control, something more deliberate was also taking shape. The company's directors in London were not merely trying to survive the immediate crisis. They were thinking about how to ensure that nothing like it could happen again. And the conclusion they reached was one that would have enormous consequences for the future of the Indian subcontinent. The company needed a navy, not a borrowed navy, not the intermittent protection of Royal Navy vessels that might or might not be available when required. Its own fleet of armed vessels, purpose-built for the protection of its trade routes, capable of projecting force in the waters where it operated, and of deterring the kind of attack that Every had made look so devastatingly possible. The logic was straightforward and, from a narrowly commercial perspective, entirely sound. The Ganj-i-Sawai had demonstrated that the wealth moving through those waters was essentially undefended. Every had noticed this. Others would notice it too, unless the calculation changed. The investment in naval protection that the company undertook in the years following 1695 was substantial. It was also, in retrospect, a significant step in a longer journey. The journey by which a trading company became something considerably more than a trading company. The East India Company's gradual accumulation of military capacity, which would eventually make it the effective ruler of large portions of the Indian subcontinent, had many causes and many moments. But the shock of Every's attack and the institutional reckoning it forced belongs among those moments. The pirate who wanted only to enrich himself nudged one of history's most consequential organizations toward a militarization that would, in time, change the world. The effects on maritime law were no less significant, and in some ways more direct. The legal proceedings against Every's captured crew members in 1696 exposed a problem that the authorities had not fully confronted before. The crimes had been committed on the open ocean, in waters that were not clearly the jurisdiction of any single nation. The victims were primarily Mughal subjects. The perpetrators were English. The ships involved flew various flags of convenience. And the courts of the era were not well equipped to handle the jurisdictional tangles that this combination produced. The first trial of Every's men, in fact, ended in acquittal, a result that sent the Crown into something close to institutional fury and prompted an immediate retrial under modified procedures designed to ensure a more satisfactory outcome. That sequence of events, crime, acquittal, outrage, procedural revision, conviction, reads, to a modern eye, as troubling in its implications about the independence of judicial proceedings from political pressure. But it also drove something genuinely important. the legal thinking that emerged from those trials, and from the broader crisis of piracy in the Indian Ocean that Evry's attack had dramatized so vividly, contributed directly to the development of the legal doctrine of universal jurisdiction over piracy. The idea, which became firmly established in international law over the decades that followed, was straightforward in principle and radical in implication. Pirates, by virtue of their crimes against the common commerce of all nations, were enemies of all mankind, hostes humani generis, in the Latin of the legal scholars, and could therefore be tried by any nation that captured them, regardless of where the crimes had been committed or what flags had been flying. This doctrine became one of the foundational principles of international maritime law, and it persists in recognizable form to the present day. Henry Evry did not create this doctrine single-handedly. Legal ideas have long genealogies and multiple parents, but the crisis his attack provoked gave the doctrine an urgency and a political momentum that accelerated its development and its adoption in ways that are clearly traceable in the historical record. He made the problem undeniable, and undeniable problems eventually produce legal solutions. The effects on the pirates themselves, on the broader community of men who lived outside the law on the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in this period, were equally significant, though they played out more slowly and more unevenly. Every success was, in the short term, an inspiration. Word of the Ganj-i-Sawai prize spread through the pirate world with remarkable speed, reaching the taverns and anchorages of the Caribbean and the American colonies and the coast of West Africa within months. The numbers, embellished in the retelling as numbers always are, painted a picture of what was possible that fired the imagination of men who had been making do with much more modest prizes. If one ship, in one engagement, could yield that kind of return, then the Indian Ocean was where a man with ambition and a fast vessel ought to be directing his attention. The years immediately following 1695 saw a significant increase in pirate activity in the waters around India and in the Red Sea approaches. Men who had operated primarily in the Atlantic shifted their operations eastward. New crews were assembled with the explicit goal of reaching the waters where Evry had made his fortune. The so-called Golden Age of piracy, which historians generally date from roughly 1680 to 1730, reached something close to its fullest expression in the decade after Evry's attack. And while there were many factors driving that intensification, the gravitational pull of Evry's example was among the most direct. The names that populated that golden age, men whose stories would eventually eclipse Evry's own in popular memory, partly because they were caught and he was not, came in his wake. Edward Teach, whom history remembers as Blackbeard, was active in the Caribbean and along the American coast in the years between 1716 and 1708. Bartholomew Roberts, arguably the most successful pirate in purely quantitative terms, took more prizes than any other captain of his era in the early 1720s. Calico, Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, Mary Red. The figures who would populate the mythology of the age were active in the years and decades after. Evry had already passed from the scene. They inherited a world he had helped to shape, and they inherited, along with its opportunities, the increasingly organized and increasingly determined response that Evry's attack had done so much to provoke, because the other thing that Evry's success produced, alongside inspiration, was an intensification of the forces arrayed against piracy that would, within a generation, bring the Golden Age to a decisive close. The Admiralty Act of 1700, passed by the English Parliament in direct response to the difficulties the 1696 trials had exposed, established admiralty courts in the colonies with the power to try piracy cases without juries, removing the risk, from the Crown's perspective, of sympathetic local juries acquitting men whose crimes were well documented. This was not a trivial change. Jury trials in colonial ports had been, for pirates, a meaningful protection. Juries drawn from port communities often had complicated feelings about men whose spending enriched local economies and whose crimes were committed far away against foreign victims. The removal of that protection made conviction dramatically more likely, and, in combination with the bounties and the naval patrols that were steadily expanding through the first decades of the 18th century, began to shift the risk calculation for men considering a life outside the law. The Golden Age ended not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow tightening, a gradual closing of the spaces where men like Avery had once operated with relative impunity. The jurisdictional shadows grew smaller, the naval presence grew larger, the legal consequences grew more certain and more swift. By the 730s, the kind of career that Avery had pursued in the 1690s had become, if not impossible, then far more likely to end at execution dock than on a quiet Devon hillside. Avery had caught the tide at its highest point. He had moved through a world that was, for one brief and unrepeatable moment, disorganized enough and vast enough, and legally ambiguous enough that a man of his particular qualities could take everything and disappear. The world that came after him was, in no small part, a world that had reorganized itself in response to what he had done. He had not merely robbed a ship. He had provoked an empire, reformed a legal system, militarized a trading company, inspired a generation, and accelerated the very forces that would eventually end the age he had so spectacularly represented. Not bad for a Devon sailor who just wanted to get paid. History is, at its heart, a discipline of resolution. It likes endings it can point to, graves it can locate, judgments it can record. The archive wants a final entry, a date, a place, a closing of the ledger that allows the story to be filed away and the next one opened. Most stories, eventually, provide this. Most lives, however extraordinary, conclude in some fashion that the record can acknowledge and the historian can note with the quiet satisfaction of a completed account. Henry Avery never gave history that satisfaction, and in withholding it, he did something that very few figures of his era managed to do. He stayed alive in the imagination in a way that resolution would have prevented. Because a story with a clean ending can be finished. A story without one cannot. It simply continues, quietly, underneath everything else, waiting for the mind that will pick it up again and turn it over and find that the questions are still warm. The question that history returns to most persistently is the simplest one. Did he get away with it? Truly, completely. The honest answer, which is the only answer a careful historian can offer, is that we do not know. The evidence we have suggests that he survived. The evidence we have suggests that the money, or much of it, was lost to men he trusted unwisely. The evidence we have suggests that he ended somewhere modest and quiet, far from the waters that had made him extraordinary, living the diminished and careful life of a man who carries a secret too dangerous to share and a past too large to escape entirely. But the evidence we have is thin, and thin evidence, stretched over a life as remarkable as Avery's, has a way of bending toward the shape that the imagination desires rather than the shape that the facts demand. We want him to have gotten away. We want the pirate king of Madagascar to have been real, the fortune to have lasted, the Devon hillside to have been peaceful and comfortable and earned. We want the story to have a good ending, which, in the context of a pirate's life, means an ending that the law did not provide. Whether we get to want that says something interesting about us, about what we find, in the privacy of our own moral imagination, quietly satisfying. The East India Company, with its sprawling commercial empire built on relationships of dependency and extraction, is not an institution that commands much retrospective sympathy. Aurangzeb, for all the genuine grandeur of his empire, was a ruler whose own cruelties were considerable and well documented. The wealth aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai was itself the product of systems that did not distribute their benefits equitably. None of this made Every a hero. He was not a redistributor of wealth or a champion of the oppressed. He was a man who wanted money and took it from whoever had the most of it in the most accessible location. His motivations were entirely personal. And yet, the rooting interest persists. It persists across 3 centuries, and it persists across cultures, and it has attached itself to every story with a tenacity that more straightforwardly admirable figures rarely command. There is something in the clean audacity of what he did, and in the completeness of his subsequent disappearance, that bypasses the rational moral assessment and goes straight to something older and less governable in the human response to a story. He saw the thing. He took the thing. He left. The literary legacy that grew up around him is testimony to how powerfully that simple arc lodges in the imagination. Daniel Defoe, whose connection to the Henry. Every story is multiple and well documented, drew on the pirate world that Every had helped to populate when he wrote his great novels of survival and reinvention. The character of Captain Singleton, one of Defoe's less celebrated but genuinely fascinating protagonists, is a pirate whose arc echoes Every's in several unmistakable ways. Robinson Crusoe himself, the castaway who builds a world from nothing on a remote island, who operates entirely outside the structures of civilization and yet maintains or reconstructs a kind of moral order, belongs to the same imaginative universe that Every's disappearance into Madagascar had helped to conjure. The pirate, as a figure of popular culture, which remains with us today in films and novels, and the iconography of 1,000 different commercial products, traces a significant part of its genealogy back to the years immediately following Every's attack. He did not invent the pirate as a romantic figure, but he provided the template with unusual clarity. The ordinary man, the mutiny, the audacious prize, the impossible escape. And the storytellers who came after him recognized the template's power and used it accordingly. What is perhaps most remarkable, when you step back far enough to see the full shape of the story, is how much Every accomplished without any apparent intention to accomplish anything beyond his own enrichment. He did not set out to reform maritime law. He did not set out to accelerate the militarization of the East India Company, or to inspire a generation of pirates, or to provide the raw material for a century of popular literature. He set out to get paid. He had been cheated of his wages, in his estimation, and he intended to remedy that situation on a scale that was, admittedly, somewhat disproportionate to the original grievance. The disproportionality is, in the end, what makes him worth remembering. There is a word that keeps appearing in the accounts of Henry Every, in the historical literature and in the contemporary documents alike, and that word is audacity, not cruelty, which distinguished other pirates of his era, not ideology, which animated some of the more romanticized figures of the Golden Age, not even exceptional seamanship. Though he was clearly a capable navigator and commander, what Every had, in quantities that the record makes plain, was an absolute willingness to attempt the thing that other men looked at and decided was too large. The Ganj-i-Sawai was too large. The Mughal emperor's own ship, flying the imperial flag, carrying the wealth of a civilization. This was not a target that a prudent man selected. A prudent man looked at that ship and thought about the consequences, and found a smaller target whose seizure would not bring the world down upon his head. Henry. Every looked at that ship and saw the answer to every problem he had ever had, and he went and took it. That quality, the refusal to be deterred by the scale of the thing, is not, by itself, admirable. Applied in other directions and by other temperaments, it produces catastrophe rather than legend. But in every's case, combined with the patience and the discipline and the tactical intelligence that made his approach to the Bab el-Mandeb Straits so effective, it produced something that the historical record has not quite been able to put down in 300 years. He stands at the intersection of the real and the mythological, which is exactly where the most durable figures tend to stand, real enough that the documents confirm him. The muster rolls, the court records, the company dispatches, the royal proclamation with his name on it, mythological enough that the documents cannot quite contain him, cannot close the account, cannot provide the final entry that would allow the file to be sealed. The sea took him in the end, not to a watery grave perhaps, but back into itself, back into that vast and patient indifference that had always been his truest element. The ocean does not keep records. It does not issue death certificates or file burial notices. It simply continues, moving under the same sky that moved above the Fancy on that September morning in 1695, carrying no particular memory of the men who crossed it, and no particular judgment on what they did while they were there. Henry. Every crossed it. He took what he came for. And somewhere between the water and the silence, he let the world lose him. We are still, in our way, looking.